3 cattle dead. No tracks led away. The grain in the feed trough had been sorted by size and shape. The moon would not be full for 11 days. I am Edmund Harrow, 30, 8 years of age at the time of these events. Field investigator for Continental Agricultural Assurance Corporation of Chicago, Illinois. I have written this account at the instruction of my physician, who believes the act of setting down what I witnessed in Harlan County, Nebraska in October of 1908 will reduce the severity of what he terms my nocturnal disturbances. I have agreed to write it. I do not agree that writing it will help. But I am writing it, and I will write it the same way I wrote every field report in 17 years of professional investigation, in the correct sequence, with precision, and with every measurable detail given its measurement. I was dispatched to the Wallace Farm on the 3rd of October, 1908, by my supervisor Mr. Aldrich Crane of the Chicago office, following a livestock damage claim submitted by one Arthur Wallace of rural Harlan County, Nebraska, who had reported the deaths of 14 head of cattle over a period of 3 weeks. The claim was substantial, covering both replacement value and a small business interruption provision, and the insured circumstances were such that Crane wanted boots on the ground before authorizing payment. He had sent me because I was the best man in the Western office, and because he believed I did not frighten easily. Both assessments had been accurate until October of 1908. The drive from Minden, where I had arrived by rail, took 4 hours over wagon track through farmland. That would have been unremarkable to anyone who had not been doing this work as long as I had. I had inspected farms across Nebraska, Kansas, and the lower Dakotas over the better part of 2 decades. And I knew what farm country looked like and smelled like and sounded like in October. The stubble fields pale gold, the air thin with a cold that had not yet committed itself to winter, the smell of turned earth and dried corn husks, and somewhere beneath it the sweetness of organic matter, moving toward dormancy. These are the ordinary sensory markers of the Great Plains in autumn, and I recognized them as I drove the rented buckboard north and west out of Minden, and they were ordinary, and then they stopped being ordinary, and I will now describe exactly where and how. 7 miles from Minden, near a bend in the wagon track where a stand of cottonwood trees marked what had once been a creek bed, now mostly dry, the smell changed. I noticed it first as an absence. The ordinary smell of the field simply stopped, replaced by something layered and complex that I struggled to name with precision. The upper register was animal musk, dense and oily, like the interior of a wolf pen, but amplified to a degree that suggested an animal of considerably greater mass than a wolf. Beneath the musk was something sweet, not pleasantly sweet, but organically sweet in the way that meat, exposed to open air for too long, becomes sweet, and beneath that sweetness was something I cannot adequately name, except to say that I felt it in the back of my upper teeth and in the bones of my jaw rather than in my nose, a low resonant quality to the air itself that the sense of smell cannot properly account for. I noted it in my field book as persistent anomalous odor, possible large predator marking in vicinity. Investigate. I did not investigate. I drove on toward the Wallace Farm, and I did not stop at the cottonwood stand, and I cannot explain now why I did not stop, except that something about the air in that place made the back of my hands cold in a way that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. The birds were wrong in that place too. Not absent entirely, but wrong in a specific way. The meadowlarks that had been calling across the stubble fields on both sides of the track for the whole of my drive from Minden went quiet inside a radius around those cottonwoods that I estimated at approximately 200 yards, and did not resume calling until I had driven well beyond it. I gave this a practical explanation. Something had killed in that stand recently, and the birds had learned the precise geography of the threat. This was reasonable. I believed it at the time. The Wallace Farm sat at the end of a half-mile access track that branched from the main wagon road, and it was an ordinary working farm of the type common to that part of Nebraska. A white frame house of 2 stories in need of fresh paint on the south face. A large bank barn of weathered red boards, 2 smaller outbuildings, a corral with a split rail fence in good repair, and a well in the yard between house and barn. Arthur Wallace met me at the gate. He was a man of perhaps 50, lean and sun, darkened with large capable hands and small careful eyes, and he shook my hand with a grip that was entirely too controlled, the concentrated grip of a man working to appear normal. His wife Mabel did not come out of the house. I noted this. The only other person on the property was his farmhand, a younger man named Cleet Purvis, who stood near the barn with his hat in his hands and did not meet my eyes when I looked at him. I noted this also. I introduced myself, stated my purpose, and asked Wallace to show me where the cattle had been killed. He showed me the barn first, and the first thing I noticed was the smell. Stronger here than at the cottonwood stand, and with a quality I had not encountered in any professional capacity. Before, the upper register of musk was the same, but beneath the sweetness was something unmistakably biological and wrong. A smell I associated from experience with animal pathology, with tissue damage and internal hemorrhage, though the barn had been cleaned and the bodies long removed. Old blood persists in old wood. I know this from 17 years of field inspection. What the walls of that barn returned to the air was not merely old blood. The claw marks on the east interior wall were what stopped my professional function for the first time in my career. They were parallel, 4 lines, and they ran along the wall at a height I measured at 9 feet 2 inches from the floor. I measured this 3 times because I did not accept my first measurement, 9 feet 2 inches. I have investigated bear predation in Wyoming and Montana, and a large grizzly standing at full extension on its hind legs may reach 6, perhaps 6.5 feet with its claws. These marks were 9 feet 2 inches from the floor, and they were not the marks of a bear. The spacing between the outermost marks was 19 inches, wider than my own outstretched hands, held fingertip to fingertip by nearly 5 inches. The depth of penetration into the old pine boards was 3/4 of an inch at the deepest point, which I measured with my pocket knife. 3/4 of an inch of penetration into hard, dry, decades-old pine. I went outside and examined the fence line of the east corral. 2 posts had been removed, not broken, not pushed over or pulled sideways. Removed, pulled directly upward from the earth. The tamped soil around each base, showing a circular compression pattern, consistent with something gripping the post from the outside and applying force straight up. Post, pulling tools leave their own marks on wood, and these posts had no such marks. Something had gripped them and pulled, and the diameter of that grip, inferred from the compression pattern in the earth, was consistent with a hand spanning approximately 14 inches. I spent the remainder of that first day interviewing Wallace, who answered my questions in short, measured sentences from which all spontaneous information had been deliberately extracted. He had found the first cattle dead on the 14th of September, others on the 18th, the 23rd, and the 1st of October. He did not know the cause. He had seen no animal he could identify. He wanted the claim authorized and he wanted me gone. These desires were communicated without words. Through the angle of his body toward the house and the way, he answered questions by redirecting them. What does the company need from me, Mr. Harrow? And will this be enough for the claim? I asked if he had reported the incidents to the county sheriff. He said the sheriff had come once. He did not say what the sheriff had concluded. I would learn later from the sheriff himself, a man named Dalton, that he had driven out to the Wallace property on the 24th of September, had stopped his automobile at the end of the access track, and had returned to Minden without getting out of the vehicle. He had not gone back. The farmhand, Cleet Purvis, was different from Wallace in one important respect. He wanted to tell me something. I recognized the signs from years of investigative work, the way a person orients their body toward a private conversation. The way their eyes go to the employer's back and return to you carrying something urgent. I contrived to be near the well pump when Wallace went inside for supper, and Purvis was beside me in 3 seconds. "You know what this property was before Wallace bought it?" Purvis said. His voice was barely above a murmur and his eyes were fixed on the house. I said I did not. "It was the Wenceslas place," he said. "Old man brought something with him from the old country. Something he thought he could manage." He stopped. His jaw worked. He was going to say more. Wallace appeared in the doorway of the house. Purvis straightened and stepped back and said, "Louder, I'll take care of the pump, Mr. Harrow. She'll come back to pressure with a good prime." And he worked the handle and water came. And neither of us said anything further that evening. Purvis was gone the next morning. Wallace told me he had resigned in the night and taken his wages and walked to the wagon road. His bunk was empty and his personal effects were gone. But there was a smell in the bunkhouse that was not Purvis's smell. And the door of the bunkhouse was standing open when it had been latched the night before, and there was something on the floor near the threshold that I noted in my field book as dark organic staining, possible blood, origin unclear, requires laboratory analysis. I never obtained the laboratory analysis. I left the staining where it was, and I closed the bunkhouse door. And I said nothing about it to Wallace. And I will carry that particular silence to my grave. That night I will write precisely. I was sleeping in the room Wallace had given me on the upper floor of the farmhouse, east, facing window, a room that smelled of long dessous and old wool, and beneath that the faint, persistent smell of the barn that I had come to understand permeated the entire property. I had latched the window. I had checked the latch. I was not asleep at midnight because I had not been able to sleep, and I am now obligated, in the interest of precision, to say that I knew something was outside before I heard it. Knew it the way a burrowing animal knows the predator that has stopped moving above it. A knowledge written below thought, beneath language, in the body's oldest grammar. Then the sound began. I have attempted to describe it many times. It was not a growl in any sense I had previously understood that word. It was not a howl. It was sustained, and it was low, and it had a harmonic complexity, a layering of registers, the way a pipe organ sounds when multiple stops are opened simultaneously. Except that this sound came from a living throat, and what it communicated, and I use the word communicated deliberately, because it was not merely sound. It had content, was something I can only describe as patient inquiry. As if the thing producing it was asking a question it already knew the answer to. The sound moved. It circled the farmhouse from east to north to west, the footfall beneath it inaudible, its position inferred only by the movement of the sound itself. Each circuit took approximately 45 seconds. It made 11 circuits. I lay with the covers to my chest, and my eyes on the ceiling, and I controlled my breathing by counting, a technique I learned from a military surveyor I worked alongside early in my career. I told myself the sound was wind through a gap in the barn boards. I told myself it was a large dog, a neighbor's animal, lost in calling. I applied professional conviction to both explanations. Neither held for more than a few seconds at a time. My right hand was under the pillow on the grip of my .38 Colt revolver, which I carry in the field as standard practice, and the metal of the grip felt cold, in a way it had never felt before. On the 11th circuit the sound stopped. Not faded. Stopped, the way a sound stops when the thing producing it has decided to stop. I lay still until dawn made the ceiling pale, and the birds resumed in the distant fields. And then I got up and went downstairs, and made coffee on Wallace's stove, and said nothing about the night. I stayed 4 more days. I will be precise about what I saw and when. On the second day, I rode the fence perimeter with Wallace, and found 2 more posts, removed in the north pasture in the identical fashion as those in the east corral, same upward force, same 14-inch grip compression in the soil. I photographed them with my field camera. in the soft mud near the north fence line, where drainage from a small ditch had kept the soil moist, I found a track. I measured it. I photographed it. The track was roughly human in outline, bipedal. The heel and ball and toe impressions recognizable. But the proportions were wrong in every dimension. Overall length 17.5 inches. Width at the ball 9 inches. The toe impressions were elongated and closely grouped, in a manner inconsistent with any human foot I have ever encountered in my professional experience, or in any reference I have subsequently consulted, and each toe impression ended in a deep circular penetration of the soil, approximately 1 inch in diameter, consistent with a pointed terminus, a claw or its functional equivalent. The depth of the heel impression was 3.25 inches. I tested the mud's resistance by pressing my own boot eye. At 178 pounds, sank 7/8 of an inch. What produced the track I measured weighed, by calculation I do not wish to verify, considerably more than I do. On the third day, near the cottonwood stand at the far end of the access track, I saw a forearm. I had walked to the rural delivery box at the Wagon Road Junction that morning, and as I returned I passed within 30 yards of the nearest tree, and I saw, briefly, for perhaps 3 seconds, a forearm extending around the right edge of the nearest cottonwood trunk. It was extended at what I estimated as shoulder height, which placed the shoulder of whatever owned it at approximately 7 feet above the ground. The arm was covered in dark fur, not the uniform dense fur of a wolf or bear, but something coarser and longer, with a matted quality that caught the morning light unevenly, as if the fur had been wet recently, or had absorbed something that changed its texture. The hand, and it was a hand, the digits individually articulated, the thumb present and opposing, was pressed flat against the bark with a deliberateness I will describe exactly. It was the posture of a man pressing his palm against a wall to steady himself while he leans around a corner to look. The knuckles were pronounced. The skin of the palm, where fur did not cover it, was deep gray, the gray of old weathered leather, and the fingers were disproportionately long, and the middle finger alone, laid flat against the bark, spanned what I estimated at 6 inches from its knuckle to its tip. I stopped walking. The arm withdrew. I stood on the access track for 40 seconds by my watch. My legs did not carry me toward the cottonwood. I will offer no qualification beyond the physical fact. They carried me back toward the farmhouse at a pace I will not call running, but which covered the ground considerably faster than any direction I had previously traveled it. I said nothing to Wallace. That night the sound did not return. The silence was worse than the sound had been. On the 4th day I drove to Minden and spoke with Sheriff Dalton, and I asked him about the Wallace Farm and the Wenceslas place, and he looked at me for a considerable interval before he answered. He said the county had no active investigation. He said the farm had been the site of recurring livestock loss and structural damage for many years, and that the nature of these incidents was not one he cared to discuss. I asked if he would accompany me back to the property. He said he would not go to that property after dark. I asked him why. He looked at me again for that long, careful interval, and he said, "Mr. Harrow, there is a railroad out of Minden on Thursday morning at 7:45, and I would not be in Harlan County on Friday morning if I were standing in your shoes." Then he stood and walked to the rear of his office and did not return, and his deputy, who had been listening from a chair in the corner, watched me rise and cross to the door. And as my hand closed on the door handle, he said, very quietly behind me, "It don't wait for the full moon. That's what people don't understand. The moon rising up makes it hungry. Full moon just makes it loud." I did not take the Thursday train. I returned to the Wallace Farm that evening, because I am a professional investigator, and I had not completed my investigation. And because I believe now, with the clarity that comes from distance, that I was also afraid to appear to be afraid, which is a failure of rational judgment, I have since accepted in myself without pleasure. I found the farmhouse dark, and stabled my rented horse, and went inside and found Mabel Wallace in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a kerosene lamp burning at its lowest setting, and her hands folded on the surface in front of her, and her eyes on the door. When I entered, she looked at me with an expression I had not seen on a living person before, not precisely fear, not precisely resignation, but the expression of someone who has sustained fear for so long that it has ceased to be an event, and has become the medium through which all events occur. And what her face now showed was not fear itself, but the particular exhaustion of a person who has forgotten what it felt like before. "He's in the barn," she said. She did not mean Purvis. Purvis was gone. She meant her husband. "He goes in on nights like this, to keep it away from the house," she said, this in the same tone she might have used to say, "He leaves his boots at the back door," the tone of a woman describing a habitual small accommodation. I asked her what she meant. "Arthur manages it," she said. "He's always managed it. His father helped him learn it. Old Wenceslas showed the family how before he sold the place." She looked at her folded hands. "It was supposed to wait for the full moon. That was the arrangement. You feed it on the full moon, and it holds to the rest of the month." She paused. "But it came early this autumn. 2 years now it's been coming early. Arthur says it's grown past what it used to be. Says it doesn't hold to the arrangement anymore." She looked up at me. "Mr. Purvis found out what Arthur's been bringing it." I asked her if the cattle were the offering. "Were," she said. "Before he ran out of cattle." She did not elaborate. She did not need to. I was at the door. My .38 was in my right hand, and the lantern was in my left, and I crossed the yard to the barn. And I want to be careful about what I report from this point forward, because these are the events for which I anticipate the least credibility, and I have therefore been the most precise in preserving them. I pulled the barn door open. The smell hit me like a physical blow. Not the layered, partially dissipated smell of the previous days, but the full concentration of it, unmediated, immediate, filling my mouth and nose and sinuses, and that place behind my molars simultaneously the musk, and beneath it the sweet organic wrongness, and beneath that the resonance in my jaw bones that I had first noticed at the cottonwood stand 7 miles from the farm, which I now understood was not a smell at all, but a frequency, produced by the proximity of whatever was inside, a vibration of the air itself that my body registered as sensation in the hardest bones of my face. It was like breathing something solid. I raised the lantern. The barn was 20 feet wide and 40 feet long, and it was full of that smell and full of something else. Arthur Wallace was in the far corner, near the old stone foundation wall, on his knees in the posture not of prayer, but of a man placed there by external force, crouched and motionless, and he was looking at something across the center of the barn floor. That was not me. I followed his gaze. I have spent 17 years approaching what I must now write, and I will write it now, as a professional obligation, which is the only framework that has ever allowed me to write anything I have not wanted to write. It stood on 2 legs. The top of its head cleared the central crossbeam of the barn, which I had measured on my first day at 12 feet from the floor. It stood no less than 11 feet in height. The head was large in proportion even to that body. The skull wide and long with a cranial depth behind the face, suggesting a cavity of considerable volume, and I will not speculate on what that volume contained beyond noting that I have thought about it every night since October of 1908. The jaw was elongated, not to the full snout of a wolf, but to something intermediate, something arrived at between the wolf's design and the human design by a process that had examined both and selected the worst qualities of each. And it was open, and the teeth visible within it were specific. The canines were enormous, yes, and the incisors large, but the back molars, the grinding teeth, were flat, the flat omnivore molars of something that chews and crushes, as well as tears. I registered this detail with the involuntary precision of a man who has been trained to see, and I have never been able to stop seeing it. The covering of the body was fur in name only. It was dense along the shoulders and the upper back, and thinned progressively toward the forearms and the inner legs and the face, where patches of exposed skin showed between the fur in a way that suggested the covering was not uniform, but functional. Not the pelt of a natural animal, but something that had grown according to different rules. The exposed skin was gray-dark, the color of old weathered leather, and it moved in small ways as the jaw moved, and as the chest expanded and contracted with each breath, and the musculature beneath it was readable the way a mechanical diagram is readable, and what I read in the diameter and arrangement of the muscles of the forearms alone was a load-bearing capacity. I associate not with living tissue, but with the structural columns of large industrial buildings. The eyes. I will describe them once. They were amber, not the flat reflective amber of an animal in lamplight, but the amber of something liquid and internally lit, with genuine depth behind them. And what occupied that depth was not the absence of thought that I have encountered in every animal I have ever faced, but the presence of it, considered amber. Amber with content. They turned from Wallace to me when I entered, and they found me with an accuracy and a speed that told me they had been aware of me before they moved, that the movement was not search, but acknowledgement. And when they fixed on my face, the resonance in my jaw bones stopped completely, and the cessation of that vibration was its own species of terror, because what replaced it was the absolute, focused silence of something that had decided I was the only thing in the room that mattered. It produced a sound, not the circling sound of the previous nights. This was singular, brief, and lower, a single sustained exhalation from a chest cavity, whose volume I cannot estimate, and the sound it produced I felt in my sternum, and simultaneously in my back teeth, and in the bones of my shins. A sound below the range of comfortable human hearing, but present in the body regardless of the ear, and the physical force of it bent the lantern flame toward me, and moved the loose straw on the floor, in a slow wave, from the creature's feet outward, to the walls, and when the sound ended the barn was the quietest place I have ever occupied in my life, not because nothing was happening, but because something enormous had finished happening, and its absence was a shape. It stepped toward me. One step. The floorboards flexed. Not broke. Flexed. The old beam and board floor transmitted the weight as vibration, upward through the boards and into the soles of my boots, and I felt in my feet the weight of something that had no right to exist. I raised the .38 Colt. I fired twice. Both shots center mass at 12 feet. Both shots landed. I have been shooting since I was 11 years old, and I have never missed a target at 12 feet. The creature became still for 2 full seconds after the impacts. 2 seconds of complete stillness, during which I was aware of every sensation in my body simultaneously. The cold ground vibration in my boot soles, the weight of the revolver in my right hand heavier than it had ever been, the smell at that proximity arriving in a new register. That included something I can only describe as heat, biological heat, the warmth of an enormous living thing at close range, and beneath my ribs my own heartbeat, doing something that was not quite beating. That was more like striking. A rapid forceful strike against the inside of my chest that I felt in my throat and behind my eyes. Then it made a sound I will not attempt to describe or record. I am exercising professional judgment in declining to describe it. I am exercising it now. It stepped back. Then again. Then it stepped through the far wall of the barn. Not through a door. Through the wall, the old boards exploding outward, into the dark field like they were paper, a detonation of dry timber. And then there was the night beyond where the wall had been, and the sound of something moving through it at a speed that had no referent in my professional or personal experience. And then nothing. Darkness. Field. The smell dissipating. I stood still. Nothing. I went to Wallace, and I helped him to his feet, and I walked him across the yard to the house, with my body between him and the dark for every step of that distance. and I had 2 rounds remaining in the cylinder, and I counted them 3 times during the crossing, and my hand on his arm shook in a manner I neither concealed nor tried to control, because there was nothing to be served by either. We sat with Mabel Wallace in the kitchen until morning. None of us spoke. The lamp oil ran out an hour before dawn, and we sat in the dark, and I do not have full memory of those hours. My field notes from first light are complete, written in the farmyard in my standard hand, which was steady, because field notation is a muscular habit older and more reliable than the rest of me. I left that day, returned the horse in Minden, took the train to Chicago, filed my report recommending full payment of the Wallace claim, on the basis of verified livestock loss, due to verified predator activity, 'cause undetermined. Crane authorized it. He looked at my face when I came in, and he did not ask detailed questions, and I have since counted that among the few genuine mercies I have received in this profession. I had removed one item from the Wallace Farm, without disclosure. Nothing physical, only an observation I had recorded in my field notes, and not yet shared in any official capacity. Near the stone foundation wall, in the barn's far corner, in the vicinity of where Wallace had been kneeling, I had seen a chain embedded in the foundation stone. Old iron, enormous links, the chain fastened at each end, to iron staples driven deep into the stone, its total length from staple to staple approximately 8 feet. The iron of every link was worn smooth on its inner surface with the smoothness that requires not years, but decades of continuous use. I saw this while helping Wallace to his feet, and said nothing. I thought about it for 7 months, before I went back to the county deed office in Minden. The deed records established that Arthur Wallace had purchased the property from one Magnus Wenceslas in 1891. Wenceslas had himself purchased it in 1863 from the estate of the previous owner, whose name I will not record here, because I checked the county mortality schedule for 1863 and found his death date was August of that year, and his recorded cause of death, in the clerk's careful copperplate, was wounds inflicted by person or persons unknown. I cross-referenced every livestock damage and property claim I could locate in the county records against this property's title history. Claims in 1865, 1871, 1879, 1886, 1894, 1901, 1904, and 1908. I plotted each claim date against a lunar calendar. The pattern was absolute, without a single exception across 43 years of documentation. Every claim was filed in the days before a full moon. Not during, before. The moon rising, as the deputy had said. The moon going up makes it hungry. I thought about the chain, worn smooth from decades of use. The staples pulled clean from the stone, when the thing had outgrown the chain, or the arrangement, or both. I thought about the key Arthur Wallace had produced from his breast pocket the morning after, standing in the barn before the ruined wall, looking at the chain with the expression of a man reviewing the ledger of a failed enterprise. A large iron key for a large padlock, which he looked at in his palm for a moment and then returned to his pocket. I had been watching from the doorway. He had seen me watching. He had said nothing and walked past me out of the barn and back to the house. There had been no lock on the chain. When I saw it the previous night, the staples were pulled from the stone. The chain was free at both ends. The lock was somewhere in the field or the dark, or wherever things go when they have been outgrown. And Wallace had stood there, with the key to that absent lock in his pocket, looking at the evidence of an arrangement that had exceeded every boundary the arrangement was designed to contain. And he had put the key back. The cattle had not been killed randomly. They were not losses. They were payments made on schedule. For 40 years by successive keepers of a property that contains something for which the only word I have encountered in any language is old. Not as age is old, but as a category is old. A thing that predates the farm, predates the county, predates the language in which I am writing this account. Something brought across an ocean in the care of a man who believed he could manage it, who taught that management to the man who bought his land, who taught it to his son, who had been managing it faithfully until it grew past managing. The moon, the morning I drove away from the Wallace Farm, was 3 days from full. It had come 11 days early. It is still getting earlier.